neo-Nazi movement?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Немцы дают парусу деньги, парус через Рейн.
To this day, after the time in history when it was founded, we still need communism.
The gentle laborer shall no longer suffer from the noxious greed of Mr. Krabs.
Said if you could go back in time and kill baby Hitler, would you? I need to know. Hell yeah, I would.
If you're a hardline Marxist-Leninist or Rosa backstabbing suckdem, you already know what it's like to advocate for left-leaning policies on the internet. And by left-leaning, I really mean anything to the left of Reagan. It's just a constant barrage of Venezuela, Animal Farm, and human nature, just a waterfall of memorized talking points internalized since birth and spat out like the world's wrongest fountain. Even the tamest of tame suckdems are getting hit with the Venezuela line, which shows just how far right everything has gone. If you're one of those people who instinctively reject any idea of socialism or communism and just yell some overused line to debunk it without engaging in a discussion, you're probably not gonna like this video. I don't even really know what you're doing here, just go write that con about helicopters and how Vladimir Stalin killed 100 trillion people. There is a specific type of person I'm trying to reach, however. It's the type of person that understands that capitalism is flawed, but can't bring themselves to support communism or socialism simply because they've been indoctrinated since birth with the holy lines. But what about human nature, though? The biggest obstacle to being a leftist is dealing with all these gotcha marks, but once you take a step back from the flood of Vuvuzuela, you'll realize that all of them don't make much sense. The problem is that a lot of people simply haven't heard responses to all these anti-communist arguments, which is why I'm going to do the world a favor by debunking all of them, and hopefully none of us will ever have to deal with these arguments again. Oh, who am I kidding? Admittedly, this first argument is more of a misconception than anything else, and surprisingly, it tends to come from people who are new to the left, and, well, sometimes people who are just misinformed.
So what socialism means is the government does some things and the private industry does some things, right? So private industry does Coca-Cola, Nike, makes your shoes. Government does other things like your police department, your fire department, your military. So you like the military? Oh, what a socialist you are!
No. Just no. Basically, the argument goes that socialism is whenever the government does anything, so everything related to the government is socialist. Following this logic, libraries, welfare, fire departments, garbage removal, streetlights, policemen, the military, the CIA, FBI, and prisons are all socialist. Hopefully everyone can agree libraries are good, but grouping these things with the military, police, and prisons is ridiculous. The police is the same institution that shoots unarmed black men, incarcerates a massive amount of the population, and gets away with murder. This type of talk comes from people who want to normalize socialism to normies by showing them that, technically, the United States already has socialism. And while I agree that normalizing socialism is good, at the same time, it's not good to basically deprive it of all meaning. So, what is socialism? Well, it's common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Related to that is communism, which is a stateless, classless, and moneyless society with common ownership of the means of production. But wait, wasn't the Soviet Union and all those other places communist? How could they be when there was still a state? Well, they were run by communist parties, so they are in the sense that they were trying to achieve it, but strictly speaking, they hadn't achieved a communist society. That's enough definition squabbling. For the sake of streamlining the video, I'll just call any country that advertises itself as communist or socialist as a communist or socialist country, even if it's a bit of an oxymoron considering the definition. So please don't flame me in the comments, it's supposed to be an introductory video and you'll already type in. The image that comes to most people's mind when the communists or socialists talk about wanting more equality is that of a bland, boring dystopia where everyone is forced to be equal. Communism would essentially force everyone to become part of a hive mind, or at least that's how the general idea goes. However, the idea that more equality means suppressing the talented elite to the common level of the masses is just wrong. When communists say we want more equality, they mean freeing the masses so they can unleash their suppressed talents. After the October Revolution, there was a flourishing of art, culture, and creativity. The Futurist movement, legalization of divorce for women, and the growth of cinema were exciting developments compared to the Tsar's regime over the masses of people. It turns out liberating millions of people from the clutches of capital creates an exciting artistic society, not one where everyone is forced to be a hive mind and conform to some incorrect abstract idea of equality. Meanwhile, in capitalism, schools prepare students for a lifetime of work, while workers have to become mindless drones in jobs that a majority of them hate. Any sort of excitement or interest is usually reserved for the rich and powerful, while the rest of us go on with our boring lives. People worse off have to deal with the growing ecological disasters that are literally killing them and destroying their homes, while the rich profit off of ignoring any sort of sustainable solution. Maybe all this talk about a communist dystopia is really just an example of capitalism projecting itself? I've already dealt with the topic of death counts, specifically concerning Stalin, in a previous video. Needless to say, when scholars looked at actual archival evidence released from the Soviet Union, they found that death counts were actually much lower than what was previously estimated. The paper, Victims of the Soviet Penal System in the Pre-War Years, found that many of the previous estimates of historians were based on guesses, rumors, or extrapolations from isolated local observations. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I covered in the full video, but the point is, the death count of communism, which includes Stalin, tend to be overblown and exaggerated to gain more attention. A lot of the 100 million stuff comes from the Big Black Book of Communism, which was deliberately bloated to come to a nice round number. Methodology for these things is also highly suspect, as sometimes they can go as far as counting someone who stubbed their toe in a communist country another victim. This conversation about victims of communism, of course, ignores the millions of deaths under capitalism from poverty, hunger, exposure, and imperialist war. We have more than enough resources to give food, water, and treat curable diseases for everyone in the world. It's capitalism that refuses to provide these things because they aren't profitable. Excuse me, sir, but I read this one fictional book about a farm and anthropomorphic furries, and it shows that revolution will always fail. George Orwell's Animal Farm has probably done more to poison the discourse on communism than any other book. Yes, even you. The most obvious reason is that it's usually taught in schools, with students being forced to swallow everything with an uncritical mind. For those of you not in the loop, Animal Farm is basically a short book with direct comparisons to the Soviet Union using farm animals, eventually showing a devolution to a brutal dictatorship of the pigs, which is totally what Marx was advocating. It's annoying to talk about any sort of leftist policy and just get Animal Farm yelled at you, like suddenly these people become experts on socialism in the Soviet Union after reading it. I feel like it's getting to the point that people forget Animal Farm is fiction? It's not a real thing. It completely ignores the material reality that the Soviet Union had to face, namely the invasion of 14 capitalist nations that defined its policy going forward. It also has sweeping reductions of history, combining Marx and Lenin into the same character, completely missing Lenin's important contributions to the revolution, and instead pinning them on the character representing Trotsky. This complete misrepresentation of Soviet history begins to make sense when we realize that he himself had never even visited the USSR. In addition, Orwell himself was a racist and a snitch. While hypocritically complaining about Big Brother, he reported communists to the secret police and provided them with lists of names where, in typical Mayo fashion, he calls Paul Robeson, a black internationalist, anti-white, while also being bigoted against Jews and homosexuals. At the height of World War II in a strictly anti-communist society, while the Soviet people were fighting to the death against the Nazi hordes, Orwell somehow thought he was brave by speaking out against the Soviet Union, when in reality, he was just another tool of the bourgeoisie. Hopefully it's clear that Orwell is not the greatest source on communism, and that learning history from a book that literally calls itself a fairy story is not a replacement for an actual history book. If you have criticisms of the Soviet Union or communism and cite The Little Mermaid, sorry to say, but I'm not going to take you seriously. The fact that communist countries had famines is mocked again and again, but it ignores the fact that after these famines, countries like the Soviet Union and China accomplished food security for the rest of their existence. A study called Economic Development, Political Economic System and Physical Quality of Life compares socialist and capitalist countries based on different levels of development, looking at the physical quality of life of both. Data for the study was taken from the World Development Report of the World Bank. Shockingly, it found the daily per capita calorie supply was actually higher in socialist countries than those of capitalist ones. Contrary to the much proclaimed no food, the average socialist citizen was receiving more food than their capitalist counterparts. By the way, the same publication also shows that not only did socialist countries have a higher calorie supply, they also had lower child death rates, higher life expectancy, population per physician, population per nursing person, adult literacy, and secondary education. In fact, the Physical Quality of Life Index, which is a composite and derived measure, shows just how superior socialist countries are to capitalist countries in terms of quality of life. The discussion section of the study goes on to say, historically there is some evidence that the discrepancies between capitalist and socialist socialist nations have reflected varying social policies. All the socialist countries have initiated major public health efforts. These initiatives have aimed toward improved sanitation, immunization, maternal and child care, nutrition, and housing. In every case, the socialist countries have also reorganized their healthcare systems to create national health services based on the principle of universal entitlement to care. These policies have led to greater accessibility of preventative and curative services for previously deprived groups. Expanded educational opportunities also has been a major priority for socialist nations, as publicly subsidized education has become more widely available. Literacy campaigns in these countries have brought educational benefits to sectors of the population who earlier had not gone to school. Wow, what a dystopia. How dare these socialists improve sanitation, nutrition, housing, and education? This is George Orwell's nightmare. I also want to add that if you're skeptical of that study I showed, the CIA itself acknowledged that American and Soviet citizens eat about the same amount of food each day, but that the Soviet diet is more nutritious. Hopefully that completely satisfies anyone who still thinks everyone's starved under communism. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx states, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." Many people have taken this to mean that communists don't want anyone to own anything, even to the point of sharing our toothbrushes communally. Hey, it's my turn. Oh, okay, here you go. Open wide. Or. But anyway, if you actually read the manifesto, literally 1 second earlier from that quote, Marx says himself, "The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property." How communists use private property in this context is different from the common definition. Communists don't want to take away your toothbrush or things that you possess. Those are personal property. Private property are things used to make more money and give power to those that own them, like a factory, banks, offices, and infrastructure. The abolition of private property means taking those things from private hands and putting them into the hands of the community. To sum it up, communists don't want to take away your personal property, just the private property of the ruling class. But under communism, wouldn't a janitor be paid the same as a doctor? Doesn't that discourage innovation? Just like every single argument against communism, this one completely misunderstands what it is. What the question misunderstands is that socialism, which was probably what was meant, doesn't mean everyone is paid the same, just that everyone has common ownership of the means of production. And as I'll cover in the next section, there are more things than just money that incentivize humans. As for innovation, just ask yourself which country went to space first. Which country industrialized at a rapid pace, turning from a backward semi-feudal country to a world superpower? If you're looking for innovation in socialist countries, there's plenty there. Historical examples of socialism, like the Soviet Union, have provided free healthcare, education, subsidized housing that foster an environment for learning. On the other hand, capitalism gives you extortionate prices for healthcare, thousands of dollars in student loan debt, and rent payments to your parasitic landlord. Imagine how many possible scientists or visionaries have died before they could achieve anything because they were unlucky enough to be born in a poor family under capitalism. If it conflicts with profits, capitalism also often ignores and discourages science, like in the case of oil companies denying climate change. Any innovation that does take place is usually for the benefit of the capitalists, not us. Ask yourself why, when a new machine or program that can replace workers gets created, workers get laid off. The answer is that capitalists are calling the shots and want to cut costs to make sure that they can make as much profit as possible. Under socialism, where there's common ownership of the means of production, this type of innovation wouldn't result in layoffs, but rather pay raises and less working hours. Why would the workers fire themselves?
And I used to say this all the time when people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, "Oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America?" I said, "Well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want."
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism.
Communism will never work because of human nature. Humans are too greedy and lazy to do stuff unless we had a monetary incentive like we do in capitalism. Well, let's see. What other incentives could there be besides gaining money and power to get people to do stuff? I don't know, what about survival, bettering another person's life, passion, satisfaction with your work, curiosity, boredom, an output for creativity, necessity, and companionship? What do you think happened before capitalism came about? Did people just sit down in caves and die from hunger because they didn't have any monetary incentive? I'm hungry, wanna go gather some berries? Are you gonna pay me money? What's that? And speaking of pre-capitalism, humans spent hundreds of thousands of years living in a primitive form of communism where we lived communally. Incentives to work in human nature aren't static things, they're shaped by the mode of production that we live under. If we look at history, there are huge differences in human behavior throughout the world, and to simplify it all down to a monolithic human nature is ridiculous. As the famous saying goes, to look at people in capitalist society and conclude that human nature's egoism is like looking at people in a factory where pollution is destroying their lungs and saying that it is human nature to cough. Interestingly, since it's difficult to attack the basic ideas of socialism and communism, like economic democracy and work empowerment, anti-communists have to find another way of shutting these ideas down. You know what I'm talking about. If you like socialism so much, why don't you move to North Korea? Or, if you're a socialist, why do you own an iPhone and a Karl Marx body pillow? Hey, insult me, but leave him out of it. Don't worry, Carl, the boys are gone. So these arguments about socialist hypocrisy almost always never bother to address the actual ideas of socialism and serve only to attack the person talking. It's a slimy tactic that doesn't actually mean anything. The train of thought goes as follows. Socialists are against capitalism. iPhones are made in capitalism. And then their galaxy-sized brain combines these two ideas to synthesize that therefore socialists are hypocrites. The problem is that using this logic, you literally can't criticize any system at all because you're a hypocrite for living in it. I don't think I like living in a slave society very much. Haha, but you're eating food your masters gave you. I don't think I like living under feudalism very much. Haha, but you're using tools made out of feudalism. I don't think I like living under capitalism very much. Haha, but your phone and computer were made under capitalism. No matter how you spend your money under capitalism, someone is going to get exploited. That's what the "there is no ethical consumption under capitalism" meme means. Because no matter what, your consumption will always be unethical in some way. What these anti-communists are really saying is that if you're a socialist and own anything, you're a hypocrite. Which is such a good way to shut down discussion. The only way to satisfy these people is if you live in a makeshift hut in the woods, but even then they would complain that you're breathing air in a capitalist society. Not to mention that capitalism doesn't make anything. Labor does. Capitalism and socialism only determine who has control over the means of production and gets paid. As for the other argument, if you like socialism so much, why don't you move to insert vaguely socialist country here? My response is, if you like capitalism so much, why don't you move to the slums of capitalist Brazil? Hypocrite. A common argument against the far left is that, if you think about it, the far left is actually as bad as the far right. I mean, one side advocates social justice and economic equality, while the other side advocates for ethnostates and the subjugation of races of people. Jokes aside, there's an unironic strain of people who believe in horseshoe theory, that the far left is just as bad as the far right because both use violence and stuff. Such compelling evidence. Of course, horseshoe theory completely ignores any sort of deep analysis of communism or fascism. But what about the Nazi Party? Nazi stands for National Socialism, so doesn't that mean they were the same as communists? Yes, that's true, but both the German Nazis and Italian fascists purposely made sure to appear leftist to appeal to the people and muddy the waters. Apparently, they did a good job because centrists are still falling for it to this day. If we look at fascism itself, we can see that it's actually closer to capitalism than it is to communism. Fascism began when capitalists needed to revitalize profits, but were stopped by those pesky unions. So capitalists funded fascism in Italy and Germany, and once in power, those same fascists suppressed communist parties, labor unions, lowered taxes on the rich, outlawed strikes, privatized state-owned companies, and generally supported business. The word privatization was literally coined to describe fascist policies. To argue that fascism is left-wing or the same as communism would be to ignore who supported fascism and what fascism did. In reality, instead of a horseshoe, I would argue that ideology is more of a fishhook, with the far right sharing more in common with the centrists, who are ready to support fascism as soon as profit levels drop. This is another reason that fascism and communism are always incorrectly depicted to be two sides of the same coin. In fact, it's the central idea in a bunch of other arguments like communism is always implemented incorrectly, or communism only works on paper. If communism only works on paper, it's a good thing I live in paper. Anyway, these three arguments are essentially the same thing, so that's why I'm mushing them together into the same section. The idea that communism is inherently authoritarian is misleading, because it only developed these things after capitalism tried to crush it. In 1918-20, 14 capitalist nations invaded Soviet Russia to overthrow the communists, with the years of this civil war intensifying the Bolshevik siege mentality. The same pattern of imperialist, capitalist powers invading to protect capital can be seen in other countries that try to move beyond capitalism. The Spartacist uprising in Germany was suppressed by the Sucdems with fascist paramilitary forces in 1919. Catalonia was crushed by fascists in the Spanish Civil War in 1939. Cuba in 1961 suffered from an invasion and afterwards decades of terrorism from the US. Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in 1986, the Vietnam and Korean Wars, and so much more. As we can see, capitalism will stop at nothing, even going as far as supporting fascism if it means stopping communism from threatening the flow of capital. The reality is that revolutionary countries are not going to be allowed to develop a socialism that is unhindered. Instead, what we see is a sort of siege socialism, with authoritarian measures being adopted just to fight back the onslaught of the West. In the whole context, we can see that the totalitarianism of communism is not a natural development, but an unnatural one caused by the constant barrage of capitalist terrorism. So when communist states fail to defend themselves from capitalist massacres and genocides, then capitalists laugh and pin the blame on communism's inherent weakness. But when communist states do defend themselves, when they implement strict security measures to protect their people from capitalist death squads, then the capitalists run decrying the commies for being power-hungry monsters who were just authoritarians seeking to seize state power all along. So if communism is bad and weak when it fails to defend itself, but is also bad and authoritarian when it does defend itself, then when would communism ever not be depicted to be villainous? The answer is never, because no matter what communist states do, it's always spun to be bad. This is not an argument. It's a dogma. This argument goes hand in hand with the totalitarian one before. The idea goes that communist governments are oppressive and that the poor and downtrodden are prevented from exercising the democratic rights they had before. The truth, however, is much less dramatic. Democratic rights hadn't existed in these countries before communism arrived. Poland was a rightist dictatorship, Russia was a czarist autocracy, Albania was an Italian fascist protectorate, Cuba was a US-sponsored dictatorship, Lithuania, Hungary, and Romania were all fascist regimes. These countries had known little democracy. If you're actually curious about democracies under communism, check out this video detailing how Cuba's democratic system works. Needless to say, it's much better than the system we have in capitalist countries. So while capitalists are willing to virtue signal political rights and liberties in communist countries, they will brutally crush it if the people actually support the communist regimes. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the people held a referendum in which the vast majority of people wished to preserve the Union. Of course, the political will of the people should be ignored if it goes against capital's interests, and it went ahead anyway. If you want to discuss political rights being taken away in communist countries, there's no better time than during the overthrow of communism. Yeltsin, the US-supported capitalist president of Russia, disbanded the Russian parliament along with every other elected represented body, abolished Russia's constitutional court, banned labor unions from political activities, outlawed parties, and attacked the parliament building, killing 2,000 people. Yeltsin's popularity rating right before the election of 1996 was 8%. It got so bad that the United States had to rig elections in Russia to ensure his victory. Ironic considering today's situation. Russians. Russia. Oh my god, my throat. The same pattern existed in other former communist countries, with Marxists enduring political suppression and elections being rigged to prevent the people from voting to bring back communism. Whenever communists won victories in fair and open elections judged by outside sources like in Albania and Bulgaria, they were forced to step down from the pressure of capitalists. All this virtue signaling about political rights from capitalists goes away when the people themselves want communism back. Wow, look at that. Breadlines for the hungry people under communism. How shameful. This is obviously proof that communism doesn't— wait a second. These are pictures from the Great Depression, a failure stemming from capitalism, not communism. Although it's a common stereotype that communists are bad with economics, it's often because they get the short end of the stick. Many countries were faced with decades of maldevelopment and exploitation when communism arrived. The devastation of war meant widespread poverty and misery in Eastern Europe, China, and Russia. Communism rebuilt these countries from the bottom up, leaving them in much better shape than when they found them. In contrast to communists building up formerly destroyed nations, capitalism destroyed the economies of former communist nations. When capitalism arrived in these countries, real income shrank around 30 to 40%, rent and real estate prices soared, inflation increased, consumer spending decreased by 38% in Russia, poverty and homelessness was commonplace, death rates from suicide, illness, and infant mortality increased, security for workers became essentially non-existent, and unemployment rates went as high as 30%. Keep in mind that before capitalism arrived, communist countries had full employment, free healthcare, widespread literacy and education, along with strong worker benefits. Of course, capitalists will say, the transition to capitalism and free markets will obviously have a period of hardship, but it's only temporary until economic prosperity magically appears. But guess what? They've been saying it for decades, left at the store to go get cigarettes, and haven't come back since. It only takes a quick look at Latin America to prove that something's up. As an afterthought, it's funny how capitalist apologists will laugh at breadlines in communism, but ignore the fact that there are already breadlines under capitalism. It's called the grocery store, and you actually have to pay for the bread, and those who can't afford it just starve to death. Those commies sure are oppressive by handing out free food, huh? Sure, maybe these communist countries achieved all these great things, but doesn't the fall of these countries prove that, in the end, communism just communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was a triumph for capitalism, but that happened over a quarter of a century ago. Let's see what's happened since. Since the collapse of communism, the United States and capitalist powers have attacked and even outright invaded various countries like Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya, and the smaller interventions in between. The social democracy in Scandinavia you all love? The main reason it's so strong is because communism was literally around the corner. Without communism to blunt the edges of capital, capitalists have been free to exploit workers and are continually rolling back rights. Saying the fall of communism proves it doesn't work ignores the fact that communism did work. It provided essential services like healthcare, education for free, full employment, rough income inequality, and inexpensive housing with a reliably growing economy. Compared to the instability of capitalism, communism worked far better. The only reason communism in the Soviet Union collapsed is the West's efforts to bring it down, the strains of the Cold War with the punishing amount of its GDP spent on military, the cost of being an anchor to other socialist countries and movements, Gorbachev's awful policy failures, and a coup d'etat led by Pizza Hut.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Pizza Hut.
Look at that smug piece of shit. None of these reasons have anything to do with communism itself. On the contrary, it proves that capitalism doesn't work because of how far capitalists will go to crush any attempts at communism. As former GDR Minister Heinz Kessler said, "Sure, I heard about the new freedom that people are enjoying in Eastern Europe, but how do you define freedom? Millions of people in Eastern Europe are now free from employment, free from safe streets, free from healthcare, free from social security." Modern-day communists are often stereotyped as lazy, good-for-nothing, white college students who want nothing to do with their lives. Of course, this is all nonsense. Communists can come from any and all backgrounds, and are usually from the most marginalized groups. And if we actually look at what people who live under communism think, we can see that a majority of them actually want communism back. As I mentioned earlier, a majority of Russians actually wanted to preserve the Soviet Union in a referendum held before the switch to capitalism. In fact, now a majority of Russians actually prefer the return of socialism and the Soviet Union after all this time.
Nostalgia for the Soviet Union is strong among the older generation here. They say that 2 decades of capitalism in this declining town have spawned rampant corruption and a lawlessness that didn't exist before.
Такая атмосфера сегодня я чувствую в России. Потому что во многих городах уже поставили, мы отстали в этом вопросе. Многие не понимают, о чем говорят. Надо почитать нормальные книги, нормальную историю узнать, хорошо знать ее. И только тогда можно сказать, что он многих убил. А я думаю, мое личное мнение, что он не добил многих. Тогда бы сегодня не было такого бардака, извините, в нашей стране.
Just a note to add, these clips didn't come from a communist propaganda outlet, it came from Radio Free Europe, which is an anti-communist, American-funded organization. One comment said it best. Why are you playing yourself like this? You're supposed to be an imperialist propaganda outlet, lol. Anyway, back to the video. Another poll says that, reflecting back on the breakup of the Soviet Union that happened 22 years ago next week, residents in 7 out of 11 countries that were part of the Union are more likely to believe its collapse harmed their countries than benefited them. Here's another poll that shows the majority of former East Germans actually feel life was better under communism. Another that shows a whopping 72% of Hungarians say that they are worse off under capitalism. And another that shows that many Czechs say they had a better life under communism. And here's another that shows the majority of Serbs say life was better under Tito. Okay, you get the point. Country after country, you see large amounts of people, and usually majorities, that want to bring communism back. What a surprise that a system that benefited people's lives is actually popular with the people who lived under it, contrary to the blatant lies of those in power.
Beep boop. Apathy detected. Initiating speed round debunking.
Good. Yes, you there. What is survivorship bias? Yes. You foolish commie. Have you ever considered Vuvuzuela? There it is, the elephant in the room. I've avoided talking at length about specific countries for this video because I simply can't cover all of them and I would get a lot of comments saying I forgot to include this country or the other. But Venezuela is pretty much something that anyone to the left of Joseph McCarthy has heard, and I do mean it. So I'll make an exception this time. Now, why is Venezuela in such a bad place? Is it because of socialism? No. Venezuela funds public programs by relying on the money it makes on oil. When the price of oil collapsed, that meant a lot of its funds for these things did as well. So the root cause of Venezuela's financial struggles has to do with the sudden collapse of oil prices, a staple of capitalist markets, not socialism. Not to mention that US sanctions are wielded horrifically to cripple the economy and starve the people, and that corporations are hoarding and hiding food from the people Kulak style. Chaos, hunger, and strife is inevitable when you're the target of American imperialism. And despite this economic chaos, the people of Venezuela still support the Bolivarian Revolution, Chavez, and the democratically elected Maduro over the US-backed attempted coup. In fact, they probably support it more now because the US is starving and attacking them. The problem is that with Venezuela being America's #1 target right now, the corporate media is working overtime to try and print a lot of misinformation. Like, for example, when a news story broke out about Venezuelans burning aid, it was immediately called out as fake by people with a strange ability called critical thinking. It wasn't until weeks later that the failing New York Times finally published a piece revealing that, yes, the footage probably wasn't real. But Maduro's still a dictator, guys. Please listen to us. What I'm saying is, with Venezuela being the target of American imperialism, don't believe everything you read on the news. Like, come on guys, we've been through Iraq and we all know how that ended. Hopefully you can all see why the US is so interested in Venezuela. It's easy to debunk all these arguments, but we'll never get anywhere unless we examine why anti-communism is so prolific. Communism, first and foremost, is a threat to property owners, so ruling interests have made sure to pound anti-communist doctrine into our heads for literally centuries. I gave a little snippet of this idea earlier, but a full explanation is given by Michael Parenti in Black Shirts and Reds. In the United States, for over 100 years, the ruling interests tirelessly propagated anti-communism among the populace, until it became more like a religious orthodoxy than a political analysis. During the Cold War, the anti-communist ideological framework could transform any data about existing communist societies into hostile evidence. If the Soviets refused to negotiate a point, they were intransigent and belligerent. If they appeared to be willing to make concessions, this was but a skillful ploy to put us off our guard. By opposing arms limitations, they would have demonstrated their aggressive intent, but when in fact they supported most armament treaties, it was because they were mendacious and manipulative. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed, but if the churches were full, this meant that people were rejecting the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, as happened on infrequent occasions, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. But if they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. In this sense, anti-communism is not really a position to take, but rather an unfalsifiable religious doctrine. And as we know, anything that can't be proven false isn't scientific. Most people absorb this sort of anti-communist doctrine by osmosis simply from interacting and living in a capitalist society. They never bother even learning what communism is, just that it's against human nature and Venezuela. And have you ever heard this little book called Animal Farm? Trying to challenge these notions is exhausting simply because to them, ideas are not at stake, but rather their whole view of reality. In Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism, he discusses a widespread condition that contributes to this prevailing anti-communism. Capitalist realism, as Fisher describes, is the sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but that it is impossible to even imagine an alternative to it. As the phrase goes, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Maybe it's not that people are hostile to communism, just that the very idea of life beyond capitalism is impossible for us to even picture. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, excluding a few examples, actual existing socialism is pretty much extinguished from the world. Capitalism won, and now we take it for granted that it's pretty much all we know. Capitalist realism is so prevalent that even debunking anti-communism contributes to it. Sure, capitalism may spread poverty, famine, and war, but isn't that just reality? Isn't it utopian to even suggest that these things can be eliminated? In this way, capitalism presents itself as an unchangeable reality, therefore any action to move beyond it is simply unrealistic. But as with all realities, it's not the full story. It's entirely possible to eliminate poverty, famine, and war. In fact, we're well able to do it right now. Capitalism's need for ever-growing markets and infinite resources has depleted our planet and brings us ever closer to environmental catastrophe, breaking apart the notion that capitalism is the best system we have. Capitalism is literally going to destroy the entire planet, and we have very little time to do anything about it. We have to realize that capitalism is not natural. It is literally killing us and the world we inhabit. We must achieve an alternative, or it will drag humanity and the planet down with it.
You foolish mortal! This video is the epitome of whataboutism, strawman fallacies, and ad hominem attacks! We live in a society Venezuela, iPhones, Animal Farm, Human Nature.
Wait a second.
Hey, no, don't touch me!
Porky! I knew it was you all along! And I could have gone away with it too if it weren't for you meddling commies. Take him away, NKVD. Thank you, sir, and please be on the lookout for any more counter-revolutionary activity. I often get told in the comment section of videos that I'm biased and stuck in my own bubble. And let me just say that you're right. But the thing about bias is that it doesn't really mean anything because everyone skews everything to their own perspective. The only difference between me and everyone else is that I'm willing to admit it. Look at it this way. How many times have you heard the claims that communism killed 100 million people, or communism always leads to dictatorship? How many times have you ever complained to this anti-communist speaker here that they were being biased against communism? If your answer to the second question was 0, then what you're really mad about isn't that I'm biased, but that I'm presenting inconvenient information that goes against your worldview. Too often, skepticism is weaponized against one side without actually applying it to the other as well. I'm not asking you to accept everything I've argued without doubt, I'm just asking you to apply that same doubt to yourself and what you think you know as well. Anyway, I know you hardcore leftists in the comments will be telling me that this video reeks of liberalism and it's naive to believe that arguments, debates, and facts can win people over in this post-Trump world. And that's actually a pretty good point. I had that exact thought while I was making this video. I mean, as I explained earlier, the proliferation of anti-communist sentiment is ingrained in us, and it's almost impossible to imagine a future beyond capitalism. But maybe it's the little lib inside of me that believes that people aren't just global loudspeakers of capital. I mean, before I became the plucky communist I am now, I was just another person spouting off these exact anti-communist talking points. It wasn't until I stopped and listened to real communists that my mind slowly started changing. As for this video, I'm reminded of a line Lenin wrote after years of working on the development of capitalism in Russia. If the writer of these lines has succeeded in providing some material for clarifying these problems, he shall regard his labors as not having been fruitless. Wow, quoting Lenin, how pretentious. It's good to be back. Obviously, I probably didn't debunk every argument against communism, but I did debunk all the common ones I heard. If you have any arguments I didn't address, feel free to comment. I might make a part 2 if there's enough material. Really, the big reason I made this video was because I was tired of making the same exact arguments over and over and over again, and I wanted to sort of master a video that debunked all this stuff in one place. So if you're arguing with some anti-communists and they make one or many of the points here, feel free to link this video. And if you're one of those anti-communists who are brought here, hey, stick around for a little bit and I'll recommend some stuff to learn more about communism. As I said before, one of the biggest reasons I became a communist is because I talked and listened to real communists rather than the strawman communists we're told about. So if you have any further questions, feel free to put them in the comments. There are also dedicated subreddits to this type of thing, so if you really want to engage with communists, check out R Communism 101 or R Debate Communism. In addition, if you want to learn more about communism, there are good resources out there. Red Menace and Marx Madness are great podcasts for learning communist theory. Rev Left Radio is also good for learning about miscellaneous communist things. In fact, they have their own version where they debunk anti-communist myths. As well, there are a multitude of people on YouTube who have done a much better job debunking specific arguments, such as Hakim, Halim Al-Ra, Azure Scapegoat, and Thought Slime just off the top of my head. I also have a playlist with some great documentaries and Parenti talks that provide a wealth of information. Finally, of course, if you want to learn about communism, nothing can actually replace reading theory yourself. As for the future of this channel, I'm not planning on stopping anytime soon. I'm planning to focus more on theory, and I have a series of videos in mind. I've apologized in every video now about my upload schedule, and at this point it's probably not going to get any better. Still, I'm really sorry that this one is late by 2 years. 2 years is a lot of time, and I've grown up a lot since I first started making videos. Honestly, just follow my Twitter if you want updates in the long stretches between videos. I also now have a second channel to post memes, extra content, and other things during these breaks. I created an Instagram as well for any communist theory and book reviews I make. As the end of this video, it's a good time to talk about the current events that are going on, namely the numerous uprisings occurring around the United States. It should go without saying to please materially, monetarily, and physically support these protests in any form. I've already donated as much as I can on my part, and there will be links to donate pinned in the comments. Class warfare and the struggle against national oppression will always be staunchly supported on my end. Finally, more importantly than ever, no war but the class war.
It was better in Cuba, where I didn't see any kids with swollen bellies and hungry and begging. I didn't see any people begging. It was better in Cuba than it was in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I walk down the street and I see people in total misery and disorientation standing there begging for food, begging for money, sleeping in hallways. I see that in the richest country in the world. That's where it was better. And when you talk about freedom, that's freedom. And when you talk about oppression, that's oppression. Sleeping in a doorway is oppression. You want to know what oppression is? Then sleep in the doorways of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and you'll know what oppression is. You want to know what oppression is? Then think about the guys who sit there wondering if they're going to blow their brains out because they can't pay the mortgage on their house and they can't feed their kids and they see the whole thing falling apart. That's where it's better. And those are real things, and that's part of freedom.